Question is Mr. Stuart Dixon.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I fully recognise the educational value inherent in children visiting Parliament buildings with their schools, unfortunately neither my department nor the Education Authority, as funding authority for schools, provide specific additional schools funding for travel or lodgings for extracurricular activities. So if a school wished to bring its pupils to Parliament buildings, it is a matter for the school to organise and to fund this itself, either through its delegated budget or possibly fundraising events and or indeed parental contributions. I know the member will appreciate that the education sector continues to face extensive unavoidable cost pressures and rising service demands associated with delivering my department's statutory and policy obligations. As such, that my priority will be to provide stability and take every action possible to protect education funding and those frontline services within my department's statutory remit.
Mr. Dixon.
Thank you, and thank the Minister for his answer. Minister, in light of the budgetary challenges associated with travel for many schools, including those in my constituency, can I ask the Minister how his department ensures fair access for schools, not only to this building, but, as he said, to other extracurricular activities, particularly for schools in rural or economically disadvantaged areas of Northern Ireland, and those who can't, regrettably, raise large amounts of money through parental and other fundraising activities?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, there are various means by which funding can be raised, and I referenced that in my original response to the member. The general funding is administered through the common funding formula, and again, that is something which is touched upon in the independent review of education. That review that had been in place hasn't been taken forward. However, it is one of the areas that, when I consider a report from my department into the independent review of education, where it touches upon the funding towards schools through that funding scheme, I will look at. But the member rightly raises the financial pressures on schools. I want more funding to be attributed per pupil to each individual school. That is something that I'm putting forward as part of our bid. That way then we can get more schools in a surplus scenario where they could fund visits to this place. And I would encourage schools, Mr. Speaker, to come to this place to learn about it. I first visited this school, or this place, when I was at school. It was the then late members Billy Bell, Ivan Davis, and indeed you, Mr. Speaker, who were here at the time, and that's where I got a taste of wanting to be involved in frontline politics in this Assembly. So I certainly encourage educational visits. We in this Assembly have an excellent service that provides a lot of support for schools that visit, and I certainly would commend schools to come here.
I call Deborah.
Thank the Minister for his answers so far. The Minister mentioned about parental contributions, and obviously we do have a cost of living crisis, and it is difficult for families at the minute. So where does the Minister stand on certain schools, some schools asking for voluntary contributions from parents?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under current legislation, voluntary contributions, they are a matter for boards of governors of schools. And while the collection of voluntary contributions is permissible, any request in making that needs to make clear there's no obligation to contribute, and any registered pupil at the school should be treated no differently according to whether or not their parents or guardians have made a contribution. So it is permissible, but obviously there are certain parameters by which making such a request needs to be complied with.
Justin McNulty.
Thank the Minister for his answers thus far. In relation to funding for schools, does the Minister agree with me that the Suspending School Enhancement Programme works at St Mary's Bar, after £350,000 has already been spent, will be a waste of his department's limited financial resources, and will he agree to meet with me and the St Mary's School leadership to discuss the progress of this much needed project?
I'm not sure that that's on the topic, but I'll ask him.
Assembly wants to pay for school enhancement projects as part of its visitation programme, that would be welcome. I doubt it would go too far, mind you. The member raises an important issue around capital funding, and on day one of this Assembly I made a ministerial statement around the need for increased expenditure in our capital programme. So those enhanced programmes often are smaller than your major capitals. They should be supported. That's why I've put forward a bid as part of my budgetary process of well over £500 million to fund capital schemes. That is currently a live discussion that the Executive will need to consider as part of the budgetary process.
Question 2 has been withdrawn. I call Mr. Carl McCullion.
Question number 3.
Minister.
Speaker, the Education Authority does not conduct the formal assessments of autism and or ADHD. Assessments for autism or ADHD is only conducted by a specific group of healthcare professionals. Those are, for example, paediatricians or child psychologists. So therefore, this issue is a matter ultimately for the Department of Health.
Mr. Killian.
I would just ask the Minister to just reconsider that, even with his colleague, Minister Swan, because there's a multidisciplinary team that is there to do this, and for a child not to be able to express themselves in their first language is putting them at a further disadvantage. So I'd ask that would be reconsidered.
Minister.
The member, of course, raises an important point. This is related to education, so whilst the formal assessment isn't carried out by EA or my department, it links in with health, and it's important that we work together on this, and I want to assure the member that we do, particularly in respect of children in the Irish medium sector. Where possible, the EA does attempt to provide educational psychologists with experience in the Irish language or bilingualism, and we're also, just to assure the member, engaging with CNG and the Irish medium education sector to ensure that specific needs of this sector are considered as part of the end-to-end review of special educational needs.
Peter McReynolds.
I thank the Minister for his response on this matter. Given the barriers many children face in obtaining an ADHD diagnosis or statement, would your department consider investigating the introduction of ADHD awareness training for teachers and support staff?
Minister.
Again, happy to look at the broader issue that the members raised around autism training right across the sector. It's an important issue for people to be aware of, and I've no problem in saying to the member it's something that should be considered.
Jerry Carl. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Special schools are funded directly through the Education Authority block grant, with all staffing costs, including that of sickness and maternity absence, school rates and maintenance costs, being met directly by the Education Authority. However, my officials have been working closely with St Gerard's School and support services and the wider network of special schools to ensure, where possible, additional funding is provided to enable additional supports at a school for the emergent presenting needs of pupils and their families. And in response to emergent needs at St Gerard's, a second non-teaching vice principal post has been approved in March of this year, and a recruitment exercise is underway. During the 2023-24 financial year, St Gerard's received £312,000 in Article 60 funding, alongside additional funding totalling £75,000 across extended schools, home to school link, SEND framework implementation funding and summer provisions.
Mr. Carl.
Thank you, Minister, for the answer. It's a great school. I declare an interest of a family member who works there, and the parents of children whose kids go to St George can't speak highly enough of it, but it's criminally under-resourced, bursting at the seams, and people are literally queuing to send their children there. So welcome news on the extra post, Minister, but can you give a precise figure when there will be an increased funding so St George can do what it does best?
Minister.
Well, I'll certainly echo the remarks made by the member in terms of the excellence provided by the school. I'll not share the same language around criminally underfunded. I think there is underfunding, certainly within the sector, and that's something that when it comes to prioritising support for children that require additional needs provision, that I certainly will be prioritising and have done as part of my budget process. So I've indicated to the member around the additional post within the school, some of the funding that has been made available, and obviously the member will be aware that a business case for a new school was recently approved by the Department of Finance, but obviously that is subject to the various different stages that we need to go through and capital funding being made available.
Linda Dillon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for his answers so far. Case Ever Coog, question number 5.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Gael School in Eel is fully designed with planning approval, and an integrated supply team is in contract. Therefore, subject to the availability of additional capital budget, the project is ready to move on site. Unfortunately, as referred to in my statement to the Assembly on the 12th of February, substantial additional and sustained capital budget is urgently required before Gael School in Eel and other similar projects can be permitted to proceed to the construction stage. I have made the case for additional and sustained capital investment in our education infrastructure and have brought forward bids to the Executive for in excess £543 million of capital funding for education in the 2024-25 year, and should capital funding become available, projects will then be reviewed and prioritised for delivery.
Still.
And can I welcome the work that has been done so far by the departmental officials? They have really worked very hard on this project, and the school are very highly praising of them. But can I get a commitment from the Minister, should you get any capital, that Gael School in Eel, given that it is in contract, is an absolute priority to be moved on, because obviously there will be serious implications if it isn't?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, the member is aware of how advanced the project is. We haven't entered into a formal contract with a company to actually build, but it is at that very late stage now in terms of being shovel ready, subject to capital funding becoming available. So I can't obviously commit to funding something until I know what my funding envelope is going to be, and that is part of the budgetary process. And this school is at a very much advanced stage, but until I know what capital is available to the department, I'm not able to give that absolute commitment at this stage.
Maurice Bradley.
Can I ask the Minister, due to the condition of the school estate and due to the rising cost of new buildings, should the department not prioritise maintenance and minor projects first?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the member raises an important point, that obviously we want to have major capital developments, but we also want to have those enhanced programmes, but then there is maintenance that needs to be carried out within our school estate. So there's a whole range of areas that I would want to see capital funding allocated to, but there is a limited capital budget, and it's essential that I take forward a balanced programme of investment across all of the different programme streams. That includes new build majors through to planned essential maintenance of the current estate, and I also want to take forward a targeted curriculum-based programme in the future, such as those around sports provisions.
Nicol. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Children with a statement of special educational needs follow a different process for securing a school placement other than the general admissions process, one which seeks to ensure their needs, as outlined in their statement, are met. Each child is individually placed. Children are referred for a SEND statement and review throughout the year, which means that there is a continual flow of children entering the process. This makes alignment with the general admissions process difficult. Access to appropriate school placements for children with SEN has been the subject of much discussion in recent weeks. The demand for specialist education provision has increased significantly over the last number of years, and the system has struggled to keep pace with the rising demand. In the last 3 academic years, the Education Authority has created 140 additional classes for special schools and 203 new specialist provision classes in mainstream schools known as SPIMS. The position for this September is extremely challenging. Based on the Education Authority's latest planning assumptions, more than 1,000 additional specialist education places are needed by September of this year. My immediate priority is to increase the capacity across the education system to ensure sufficient appropriate places for children with SEN for September 2024, and the EA is working in collaboration with stakeholders and schools where it knows there are acute pressures to create additional places in both special schools and through SPIMS.
I call Kate Nicholl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for your answer. You outlined the role of the statement in this process. Does the Minister share my concern that in the past 12 months, of the 138 staff who work in that element, the statementing element within the EA, 3,042 days of sick leave have been taken? And what more can the Department do to ensure that the resource in terms of officials dealing with statementing is up to scratch? Thank you.
Minister.
Well, I am concerned at the level of sick leave in this area, and there's a number of factors that are leading to obviously delays around educational statements, psychologists, the lack of the availability of workforce in this area. That's why there is a very considerable review that has taken place when it comes to SEN, of which there are multiple different work streams. There's no one single issue is going to turn this around. But it's vital that we always remember at the heart of all of this is a child, and making sure that they get the right support by the right people at the right time. The system is failing to deliver on that. That is something that I have inherited, but that I now have a responsibility with the Education Authority to address. And I know it's an area that the member has an interest in, as does the Education Committee, and pulling in the same direction on this will be important for us to get the kind of transformation that we need, because there is a fundamental transformation in SEN that is required, so that we don't year on year have this same problem, which we are going to have this year. We need to deal with the pressures that we have, and then we need to get upstream so that we are much more advanced in our planning, that we're not dealing with a crisis management type scenario which has happened last year and is happening again this year.
Robbie Butler.
Mr. Speaker, thank the Minister for his answer and thank the member for asking such a good question. The key word in this question is appropriate places for our pupils. What work would the Minister and his department be doing to ensure that those children who do receive placements are in the appropriate school, whether that is special school or SPIM?
Well, the member raises that question around getting the appropriate place, and there have been occasions where a placement has been accepted in a school, and then it transpires that isn't working out to the benefit of the child, or indeed the family or the guardians responsible, and then you need to look at trying to make changes. So that presents real difficulty whenever a placement doesn't work out. But there is an ongoing process in terms of selecting the right school for children. And that is a process where the Education Authority engage with the family, they engage with the relevant school, and they try and make sure that the appropriate support is in place. And there are examples of excellent support and children being given the best possible opportunity, but there are examples where it hasn't worked, and that is something that we need to try and avoid in the future.
Danny Baker.
Minister, can the Minister confirm if all schools have been contacted in regard to establishing specialist provisions for the 24-25 academic year, and if not, why not?
It's an interesting question, because on some of the schools that I've visited, they've indicated to me a willingness to provide additional capacity for children that they could accommodate, and I have had to proactively connect the EA to those schools. So we have been appealing for schools to come forward. Some schools do come forward, and then they haven't felt fully engaged in the process, and I just think that's wrong. If a school wants to provide support, then it's incumbent upon the Education Authority to identify can that be achieved and delivered, because there is real challenges whenever it comes to capacity. What is also important is that whenever a school provides that place, that they then get the support throughout that child's placement in a school. And there's also examples where principals have indicated to me they have accepted a place and then they haven't felt supported, and that therefore has created a bad outcome for the school but also for the child.
Alan McGrath.
Thank you very Given that we've heard in the response from the Minister about early planning, about engagement, about new places and additional funds, and this has all been done before, and yet every year we face the same problems, is the Minister satisfied that there's going to be something different done between now and September so that we won't see the same outcome this year?
Minister.
Well, one of the steps that was taken before I came into office was to have a dedicated senior employee within EA proactively managing this, and then also the department has a steering group that's headed up at a very senior level, so that we identify how many places are needed and then proactively are seeking to place children. This requires, though, greater collaboration with the Department of Health, for example. So, the stage at which the Education Authority are cited on children that will have additional needs needs to be much earlier than 2 years and 9 months. It needs to be whenever a health worker has identified in those first months of a child's life, which they do, and support is put into place. But then the connection in terms of sharing that data between Department of Health, Education Authority and then planning seems to be a challenge, and that's something that needs to be addressed so that we get further upstream, as I talked about earlier.
The Minister will be aware that often in some schools the numbers of those with special educational needs are not included in the numbers of attendees at the school, therefore giving a false impression of the capacity and the spaces available at that school. Does the Minister have any plans to review that policy?
Obviously, whenever you're building a new school, for example, we have looked in the past at what is the enrolment in that school, and that hasn't included the number of children that attend that have a statement of educational need. That to me just doesn't make sense. You're building a new school, but then children with additional needs are regarded as supernumerary, a word that I'm not particularly comfortable with. But a school has to accommodate children with those additional needs, so therefore it should be part of the planning assumptions whenever you are considering development proposals, considering new bills. So that is something that I think the member rightly raises, which I'm looking at.
Melissa McHugh.
Shocked. Question 7.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The largest programme of work in the area and anywhere in Northern Ireland is the Strual Shared Education Campus in Omagh. With an estimated capital value in the region of £400 million, the campus will provide a state-of-the-art shared centre of learning. It will bring together 6 schools from across the Omagh community and incorporate grammar, non-selective and special school provision. Over 4,000 children and young people from all backgrounds will be educated on the campus, and I'm pleased that the Executive has confirmed its support for the programme with £150 million of ring-fenced funding for the programme committed over the next 3 years. In terms of other capital works in the area, major works at Gale School, Dara, forgive me for, I'm sure, mispronouncing that, it's in Strabane. It's currently on site and due to complete in June of this year. St Catherine's Primary School, Strabane, has an approved business case and is at concept design stages, and Dean McGurk College in Carrickmore, it was paused in 2023 and it remains so. Drumragh Integrated College Omagh is currently in design stage. St Mary's Primary School and Clocker and Strabane Primary School are progressing in design and business case stages respectively under the school enhancement programmes.
Mr McHugh.
Thank you for your answer to this point. Gale School the Hardy and Tanya Mathia, Gale School the Hardy is the name of son that school. But in addition, in Strabane we have Knockavoe Special School that has a capacity problem at the present time. Could you outline, Minister, please, just what support has been given to Knockavoe to address that problem by the Education Authority?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the correction on Gale School at Drogheda. Hopefully that's better. In terms of the specific school that the member raises around capacity, I'm more than happy to follow up in writing to give the member a detailed response to that question.
Thank you very much, Minister. Speaker, you'll be surprised to know that I'm not actually interested in West Tyrone, but more so actually how the Minister plans to prioritise all of the capital projects within his portfolio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think South Antrim is a particular interest to the member. In terms of the prioritisation, at this time, major capital funding has been available to meet inescapable pressures only. That's for the Department to continue to meet contractual obligations where construction had commenced, and to continue to honour the integrated consultant team contracts with regard to the design phase of those works. There are a number of projects which are in the position of being fully designed and are awaiting integrated supply team procurements. However, due to funding having not been permitted, these have not progressed at this stage. Should, however, additional capital funding be made available, all projects will then be reviewed and they will be prioritised to allow progression to be made.
Nick Matheson.
We're all aware of the impact of the removal of the ring fencing from the Fresh Start funding, so I'd be grateful if the Minister could confirm what consideration he undertook of options available to him to restore that ring fencing around the $150 million Fresh Start funding pot to allow those new build and other projects for integrated schools to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An issue that I've spoken about before in terms of that Fresh Start monies, and I proactively engaged with the Secretary of State, who unfortunately didn't provide a positive response around that. But what I was able to do as Minister was to move all of the schemes, with the exception of Struil, given the quantum of funding that was needed, into my conventional capital programme. And that provides reassurance for those schools that they will continue to be taken forward as part of my major capital conventional schemes. What the Executive then was able to do, because Struil was the one outstanding significant project as part of that Fresh Start monies, was to provide that ring-fenced funding of $150 million. That will allow, subject to the full business case proceeding, that will allow the project to commence. Obviously, there will be further monies that will be needed to deliver on Struil, but all of those schemes in Fresh Start either have been moved into my conventional programme, or in the example of Struil, has now been given executive priority.
Alan Chambers.
Question 8.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The approval of the planning application for the Bangor Central Integrated Primary School project on the 5th of March of 2024 is a major milestone on the road to delivery of this project. It marks the completion of the planning and design stages. As with the other former Fresh Start projects, which have now transferred into my department's major capital works programme, Bangor Central will progress to construction in line with conventional budget availability in the same manner as all other major capital works projects taken forward by my department, and I have submitted high priority bids for each of these projects to the Department of Finance as part of the budget process, and I do ask that every party at the Executive would support those bids.
Mr. Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Minister, for your answer. I do appreciate that you appreciate the disappointment felt by the parents and pupils and staff that funding for a new build was run at such an advanced stage of the planned project. Given the hugely inadequate and aged campus that does not meet their current or future needs, can the Minister offer any hope, given the budgetary pressures on his department, for a timely and positive outcome?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, of course, want to advance a major capital programme across the school estate, not just for Bangor Central Integrated, but for all of those schools. And there are over 100 major capital programmes that had been announced back in 2010. 35 of them are completed, 9 of them are currently in that contractual committed zone, but that gives you a quantum of well over 50 schemes that are not currently funded, as well as all of the other capital projects that we need to take forward. That's why, as we consider the outworkings of the budget and the agreement subsequently of the Executive of the budget paper that will come forward from the Finance Minister, education should be given a priority, because every member within these parties have been raising various different capital projects within their constituencies. There will be opportunity to prove how people are genuinely committed to funding education whenever we're agreeing a budget.
An assurance that he will continue to press the UK Government on the need for increased funding, including for schools such as Bangor Central Integrated Primary School and Prairie Integrated College in Holywood, both in my constituency.
Mr. Speaker, I can, and I know the member for North Down, Mr. Dunn, has pressed me on this vociferously around the need for capital investment for these schools. And I have already engaged with the UK Government, but the Executive collectively continues to raise the issue of funding being needed from the Treasury on a needs-based approach, and they are yet to provide the proper baseline based upon independent fiscal reports around that financial framework in terms of the appropriate funding. So we continue to press the UK Government in respect of that matter. Further resources that become available to the Executive can subsequently be allocated to different departments, of which I want education to be prioritised, and that will allow these schools and others to make more progress.
We now move to topical questions. Question 1 has been withdrawn. I call Ms Carolyn Cullion.
Yeah, it's just an expansion of the question that I asked the Minister previously in relation to what the EA can do for assessing children with ADHD and or autism and or who children are on an individual education plan through the medium of Irish. Can you just undertake to do a review of the resources, particularly in North Belfast? Thank you.
The benefit of being drawn in a question and then having a topical to follow up to continue to tease the issue out. So again, I am aware of the specific challenges in the Irish medium education sector around SEN provision and what support and resources are currently available and what further is needed. That's why we are working with CNG. We are looking at it as part of the end-to-end review in terms of identifying what support specifically in that area for children can be provided. And we also are working with the EA in terms of what training to all schools through its SEN pupil support services and psychology service has established in terms of a working group, so that best practice in the immersion of education and bilingualism can be embedded.
Gillian.
Appreciate the Minister's response and the fact that he's working with Corleon na Gaelscoileachta in terms of the end-to-end review. I would just ask that even from my experience in my constituency office, there is a lot of concern being raised by parents and guardians about the delays. These delays are appreciated across the board, but if you could even just update me by writing what the current status is of that end-to-end review with CNG. Thank you.
Mr Speaker, I'm happy to follow up with the member in more detail in terms of this area, but just to add a little bit more information, some of the areas that we're working on in terms of the provision of the Irish medium, the Middletown Centre for Autism, for example, provides workforce training, online resources and different sessions also for parents in this area. So I am aware of the issue. It transcends both education and health, where there are different statutory responsibilities. But I get that from the person that needs the assistance, they don't differentiate between education, health. They expect to get the support when they need it. And I'm alert to those issues and will follow up in writing with the member.
Corleon. Minister, due to staff shortages, there has been a number of class closures in special schools across my constituency, impacting the most vulnerable children and young people. Can the Minister outline to me the steps the Department has taken to address class closures of children with SEN across special schools in Newry and Armagh?
Minister. Mr Speaker, not unique to Newry and Armagh, but obviously it's an issue for all of our constituencies in terms of having the appropriate workforce that is available, and that's a challenge. It's a challenge in terms of the terms and conditions that the staff are operating to, attracting people into the workforce whenever we have a private sector which is growing, that are offering much better terms and conditions, and we're competing with the private sector, and we're also competing particularly in border communities with the Republic of Ireland, and in terms of what people are being offered to work in the south. So those things are a challenge for us. There's no simple answer that is going to enhance the workforce that is available, but it is an issue that we recognise we need to provide more support, and there's more work to do in making sure that there's the appropriate workforce to meet the needs which are continuing to grow.
Mr Boyle.
Thank you, Corleon. And I appreciate the Minister's answer, but the children come first, Minister. You will agree with that. Just in relation to that, have you any contingency plans to try and address the matter?
Minister. Well, obviously, I'm wanting to retain people in the workforce. That is part of the business case in terms of the pay and grading review for support staff, and that includes your classroom assistants and the other people in the workforce, and that's something that I want to see taken forward, and that will assist in trying to retain, but then we also need to identify what are the issues that we need to address so that more people will come in to the workforce.
Can I ask, Minister, I'm sure you're aware, or you'll be very aware of the financial constraints many schools find themselves in. So would you accept that there's occasions in which many of those schools could more easily and cost effectively procure goods and services than actually can be done through the process within the EA?
It is an issue that principals have raised with me in terms of particularly small amounts of monies that are needed for projects in a school, that they're having to go through an EA procurement system, which is meant to actually deliver savings because of the economy of scale that can be delivered by doing this through EA. But obviously the outworking of that, for some schools, they're saying that they could do it more efficiently and more cost effectively. So that's something that I think we need to be looking at, but I'm also alert to the various different legislation which pertains to procurement law.
Well, and given those regulations in terms of procurement, will you maybe look at some other ways we could undertake to examine how schools could find themselves maybe in a more favourable position than currently, to allow them, give them that greater flexibility to actually save money?
Mr. Speaker, it is an area that I am going to have officials look into in terms of procurement, and is there a level, albeit at a small level of expenditure, that schools can manage themselves without it having to go through EA? That's something that I'm open to, because if it can be more cost effective and delivered in a more timely fashion, then that's something that we should be considering in light of the various parameters by which procurement law pertains in this area.
Carl.
Outline whether you've submitted a bid to either the Finance Minister or the Executive to release the funds for a pay and grading review for education workers?
Mr. Speaker, yes, there was a business case submitted to the Department of Finance. The Education Authority had provided information to the Department of Education. That business case had been sent on to the Department of Finance. However, EA subsequently contacted us to say that information wasn't correct, and that delayed then the process, but my department worked at pace with the EA in order to get accurate information. That allowed a business case to be presented to the Department of Education, which my department subsequently sent to the Department of Finance for their consideration.
Mr. Carl.
Thank you. I would stress that it needs sped up, Minister. These workers have been waiting for 6 years on this funding to be released, and I think it's completely unacceptable that ministers, yourself included, got a wage increase around 90k a year, and these workers, bus drivers, classroom assistants, bus escorts, catering and other staff, and some are doing life-saving procedures, are told you have to wait again. So, Minister, I'd urge you to release the money, make sure it's released urgently.
Well, I can assure the member, Mr. Speaker, that this forms part of my bid to the Department of Finance in terms of the budget settlement for this financial year. I have met with the unions. I have indicated my support for resolving the pay and grading review issue. It is separate to the pay settlements because those workers are part of a national joint negotiating committee, and they did receive pay increases over the past number of years. The issue, however, is the baseline by which they are paid when it comes to the impact that that increase has on them, and also the wider issues around recruitment and retention of the workforce. That is why the pay and grading review has been taking place. I have supported the business case that has went forward to the Department of Finance, and it forms part of my bid in the allocation to the Department of Education, part of the budget process.
Alex.
Mr. Speaker, Minister, you mentioned about the Fresh Start funding, which has been lost for the new school builds, and that you moved that into your capital bids. Can you give a cast iron guarantee that Bangor Central Primary School, Integrated Primary School, will get a new school build?
Well, all of this is subject to capital funding being made available, and I've outlined the significant number of major capital schemes which are currently within my department. I have highlighted the inadequacy of the resources that are available, not only to fund major new builds, but enhancement programmes, tackling the maintenance backlog that exists within our school estate, and developing a capital programme that can help facilitate the delivery of curriculums in schools. And that is fundamentally important. And I have been to a number of schools. The Shankill Primary School is one, which is in an appalling condition, absolutely appalling condition. And it is there waiting for funding to be made available. So I'm not in a position to guarantee any school will get the go-ahead, other than I am making the case for very significant increases in capital funding. Should that be made available to the department, I can then review those capital projects, prioritise schemes that can be taken forward.
Mr. Easton.
Answer so far. Would the Minister be willing to meet Mr. Campbell, the head of Bangor Central Primary Integrated School, to offer some reassurance about the future for a new school build?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I always, particularly an MLA asks me to facilitate a meeting, I seek to accommodate that. So if the member wants me to do that, I'll be happy to do that. What reassurance I have provided to all of those schools impacted on Fresh Start is that they moved into my conventional programme and they are continuing to advance. And there are other major capital schools and they are not advancing within my department. Those within Fresh Start are. And understandably, other schools are saying to me, why are you pursuing the Fresh Start schools whenever I have been part of your conventional development schemes within the department? So Fresh Start schools have been given a very high level of reassurance by me, and I'm being challenged by some other schools. What about us? I want to ensure that there's fairness and equity in everything that I do as a minister when it comes to the development of our new schools estate.
Michelle Brownlee.
Just in relation to the support staff pay and grading, is the Minister in a position to update us on when they will be paid?
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously the process was a business case had to be put forward. I can confirm, Mr. Speaker, that the Department of Finance has approved the business case. So that is a significant development that they have approved it. That means it is now subject to funding being made available through the budget process. And I want to see that to be successful. I have been reassured by the Sinn Féin Education spokesperson that the Minister for Finance will look sympathetically at this in the funding that was allocated to resolve a number of the other pay settlements, of which it was 688 million. This issue was not included, but the Minister for Finance indicated that she would look at that issue subject to the business cases progressing. They have now progressed, they have now been approved, but it is now subject to the budget outcome.
Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that detailed response. I'm delighted to hear that it has been progressed and it will be approved, but obviously now we have to encourage and move this as fast as possible for all support staff within the education system.
The member is absolutely right. When we think about support staff, we're talking about some of the lowest paid workers within the public sector, and yet they're delivering vital services. Your classroom assistants, your cooks, your bus drivers, and the action short of strike in this area has been having a detrimental impact on the outcomes for children and young people, particularly in our special schools, whenever strikes have taken place. So I want to see the pay and grading review successfully dealt with. I will be meeting with the unions again on the 18th of April in order to give them another update in this area, but it is now very much over to the executive to make the funding available for this to be resolved.
Colin Gilrenew.
Minister, I wonder, could you give us an update in relation to your own view or work within the department on composite classes?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it allows schools to develop. In my own constituency, I can think of one primary school in the village I lived in McGalbury, where we moved from a 7 class base school. Enrolment was increasing as the population grew, and we then had to move to providing composite classes, and that was the only way to allow the school to continue to grow. And as populations grow, then you would want to move to having 2 class bases within a school. So I think composite classes has a role where it is meeting a need of a local population.
That concludes topical questions. We now move back to the debate, and if members would take their ease for a moment while we change the chair.